You might imagine that people in the Middle Ages lived in an era of dirt, disease, and neglect. But the reality is more nuanced and often more mundane than you think. Hygiene in medieval Europe wasn't just poor because people were lazy or uncaring. It was shaped by geography, technology, religious customs, and even social norms. When we begin to unpack what life was like, you start to see that the struggle for cleanliness was a daily, exhausting, and often largely invisible part of survival. Let's start with the most immediate question. Water. Water was not an abundant commodity in many medieval towns and cities. Wells existed, of course, and some towns were lucky enough to have rivers running nearby. But rivers were often shared with animals, industries, and human waste. So drinking from them was dangerous. Even when a community had access to a clean water source, fetching it was labor-intensive. Women and children were usually tasked with carrying buckets from wells or springs, sometimes walking miles each day. And the water often stagnated before it even reached the household. Bathing in such water wasn't always feasible, and the effort often outweighed the perceived benefit. Which brings us to bathing itself. Contrary to the modern stereotype that medieval people never bathed, bathing was known and occasionally practiced. In cities like Paris, London, or Cologne, public bathhouses existed. These bathhouses were small rooms, often heated by wood fires, where water was available for communal use. Some of these baths even had attendants who helped scrub visitors with brushes or soap made from tallow and lye. But the problem was both practical and social. Bathing was time-consuming, and water had to be heated, carried, and carefully used. Moreover, public baths could be sites of moral concern. Church authorities often associated them with sexual immorality. By the later Middle Ages, attitudes had shifted such that frequent bathing became less socially acceptable in some regions, ironically promoting even less hygiene in urban centers. Now consider clothing. Medieval clothing was not washed daily. Garments, often made from wool or linen, were expensive and time-consuming to launder. Linen shifts, worn next to the skin, were changed more frequently than outer layers. But the average citizen might only wash their tunic or gown a few times a year. Richer individuals might have servants to help, but the process still required large amounts of water and labor. This meant that dirt, sweat, and lice accumulated steadily. People coped in practical ways, for instance, scenting themselves with herbs or flowers, or using powders to absorb sweat and reduce odor. Even the toilets themselves were problematic. Chamber pots were used indoors, emptied into cesspits, moats, or directly into streets, depending on the city's infrastructure. In most towns, people simply dumped waste into the nearest open area or river. This practice created a constant risk of contamination and disease. Chronic diarrhea, dysentery, and other gastrointestinal illnesses were common. Some towns eventually built rudimentary sewer systems, but they were limited to wealthier or more densely populated areas. Rural communities often relied on outhouses or simple pits, which could become unbearable in warm months, attracting flies and vermin. The connection between hygiene and disease was known, but not in the way modern medicine understands it. Medieval physicians and scholars often believed in miasma theory, the idea that foul air caused sickness. Bathing too frequently or exposure to cold water was thought to weaken the body's natural balance, making one more susceptible to illness. This created a tension. Cleanliness could be beneficial, but too much was risky. The result was a compromise that often led to infrequent washing, minimal laundering, and reliance on smells and herbs to mask odors rather than remove them. Food storage and preparation further complicated hygiene. Kitchens were often part of the same rooms where people lived, sometimes on dirt floors or in wooden structures with poor ventilation. Raw ingredients were handled with bare hands, utensils were reused without rigorous cleaning, and pests were constant companions. Salt was a precious preservative, but it could only do so much. Mold, bacteria, and spoilage were ever-present threats, and accidental ingestion of contaminated food or water was a major cause of illness. This mundane, everyday exposure to microbes created a constant background level of sickness that few medieval people escaped. Even in religious practice, hygiene had contradictions. Monks and nuns often washed hands before meals and participated in ritual ablutions, but bathing their bodies was sometimes discouraged for fear of vanity or temptation. Pilgrimages to holy sites could be grueling, muddy, and sweaty affairs. Pilgrims might walk for days, subsist on coarse bread and salted meat, and camp outdoors. Despite the pious intention of purification, such journeys could increase exposure to lice, fleas, and disease. Children experience these hygiene challenges from birth. Midwives, often the only medical attendants during childbirth, used rudimentary tools and techniques, and cleanliness was often secondary to survival. Infants were swaddled in thick linen cloths that were rarely washed, contributing to rashes, skin infections, and discomfort. Childhood mortality was high, and part of the reason was the persistent threat of infection from everyday environments that modern society would consider unthinkably dirty. We also mustn't forget seasonal and regional factors. In cold northern climates, bathing might be nearly impossible in winter. Frozen rivers, snow, and limited indoor heating meant that people went months without washing. In warmer regions, water might be more accessible, but disease transmission through standing water and insects was higher. Every locality had its own solutions, or lack thereof, to the hygiene problem, shaped by climate, technology, and social norms. Finally, the medieval approach to personal grooming was inconsistent. Hair washing, dental care, and nail trimming were occasional tasks, rather than daily routines. Combs existed, made from bone or wood, but were often shared within families. Teeth were cleaned with rags, powders, or sticks. Soap, when used, was primarily for the wealthy or in specific religious contexts. Many relied on perfumes, scented oils, or vinegar to mask odors rather than to cleanse effectively. If you pause to consider all these mundane, often tedious details, a picture emerges. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was not simply a matter of not caring. It was an ongoing negotiation with water scarcity, social norms, labor demands, disease risk, and technology limitations. People improvised, coped, and created routines that balanced cleanliness with survival, morality, and practicality. You might think of it as a long series of small compromises, each dictated by context, resources, and perception. And yet, despite all this, humanity persisted. People survived, communities grew, cities expanded, and life went on. The next time you think of medieval filth, remember that it wasn't always about neglect. It was often about making do in an imperfect world. But even with these coping strategies, many questions remained unresolved. How did certain cities manage to thrive despite chronic sanitation problems? And what role did these hygiene practices, or lack thereof, play in shaping the outbreaks of disease that periodically devastated populations? These questions linger, inviting us to explore the next chapter: how medieval society gradually confronted its own limitations, and the surprising ways in which people tried, and often failed, to achieve cleanliness. As we move deeper into the Middle Ages, the story of hygiene becomes more complex, entangled with city planning, social status, and the spread of disease. In Section 1, we touched on the practical difficulties of accessing clean water, bathing, and maintaining personal cleanliness. Now, let's explore how these challenges shaped everyday life, public policy, and the rhythms of medieval society. One of the most persistent challenges was urban sanitation. Medieval towns and cities were growing rapidly, particularly from the 11th to 14th centuries. Streets were narrow, often unpaved, and lined with timber-framed houses that jutted into alleys. These streets served multiple purposes. They were thoroughfares for carts and pedestrians, marketplaces, waste disposal routes, and places for animals to roam freely. Night soil, the human excrement collected from chamber pots, was sometimes carted away by designated workers, but often it was simply dumped into ditches or rivers. Rainwater washed much of it into gutters, but during dry spells, the streets became stinking, fly-infested hazards. The stench was so notorious that contemporary accounts describe it as almost unbearable. Some city governments issued ordinances against dumping waste in public areas, but enforcement was sporadic at best, and compliance varied widely. In certain towns, more systematic approaches emerged. For instance, medieval London attempted to regulate street cleanliness through appointed officials known as scavengers. Their duties included sweeping streets and removing refuse, but the sheer volume of waste made this a Sisyphean task. Public awareness of hygiene was often limited, and the measures that existed were largely reactive, enforced in response to outbreaks of disease rather than as preventive measures. Water supply and wells were similarly complex. Wells were essential, but they carried their own risks. Shallow wells could be contaminated by surface runoff or leaking cesspits. Some towns dug deeper wells or used stone-lined constructions to reduce contamination, but these were costly and labor-intensive. The water had to be drawn manually, which limited its daily availability, and this scarcity meant that even those who wanted to bathe regularly could do so only sporadically. Rivers, while a convenient source, were often contaminated with industrial waste from tanneries, dyers, and breweries. Ironically, rivers were a solution and a hazard at the same time. Let's consider bathing in public baths more closely. These bathhouses served multiple purposes beyond cleanliness. They were social centers where people gathered, shared news, conducted business, and sometimes engaged in illicit activities. The water in these baths was rarely changed daily, and shared towels or sponges were common. Some records suggest that during peak usage, hundreds of people could bathe in the same facility over the course of a day. The benefits were undeniable: removal of dirt, sweat, and skin oils, but the risk of spreading skin diseases, lice, or fungal infections was significant. Over time, moral and religious concerns began to dominate the discourse about public bathing. Church authorities sometimes preached against it, associating nudity with temptation. As a result, public bathing declined in certain areas by the late Middle Ages, leaving citizens to cope with less structured hygiene options. Clothing was another critical factor in medieval hygiene. Wool, the most common material, absorbs sweat but dries slowly, creating a damp environment for bacteria and lice. Linen, worn next to the skin, was washed more frequently, but large garments were costly to clean. Laundry required significant labor, hauling water, boiling or soaking clothes in lye-based solutions, beating them to remove dirt, and drying them sometimes in shared courtyards that attracted flies. Many people relied on garments layered over each other to extend usage, which helped preserve precious clothing, but increased the risk of odor and infestation. Clothing was also a marker of social status. Wealthy families could afford frequent washing and new garments, while the poor made do with the same tunics year after year, intensifying hygiene disparities. A particularly grim aspect of hygiene was the prevalence of lice, fleas, and other parasites. These were nearly universal companions, thriving on clothing and bedding. Medieval remedies ranged from the practical to the bizarre. Herbal powders, combing, shaving, and the use of scented oils. Fleas, in particular, were vectors for disease, though the connection between fleas and plague would only be understood centuries later. Households often shared beds, increasing the risk of transmission. Bedding was rarely washed. Instead, straw or rushes were replaced periodically. The constant presence of parasites shaped the experience of daily life in ways that we might find uncomfortable to imagine. Food hygiene intersected closely with personal and urban hygiene. Markets in medieval towns were bustling but unregulated in the way we understand today. Meat, fish, and dairy products were sold without refrigeration, often displayed on wooden stalls in the open air. Flies were omnipresent, and contamination was a constant risk. Preservation methods included salting, smoking, or pickling, But even these techniques could fail if not executed properly. Kitchens were dusty, smoky, and often shared with storage areas for grain or vegetables, compounding the risk of spoilage and rodent infestation. Households relied heavily on sensory inspection, smell, taste, and texture to judge whether food was safe. Despite these precautions, illness from contaminated food was widespread, and outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, or other infections were recurring threats. Religious and cultural norms influenced hygiene practices in surprising ways. Christianity, for example, encouraged ritual purification, particularly for monks, nuns, and clerics. Hand-washing before meals and certain ablutions were standard. But full-body bathing was sometimes discouraged to avoid vanity or lustful thoughts. Pilgrimages were a common religious practice, involving long, arduous travel under unsanitary conditions. Pilgrims often washed in rivers, sometimes in freezing water, in the hope of spiritual cleansing. These journeys highlight a paradox. The pursuit of spiritual purity often led to physical exposure to filth and disease. Children's hygiene illustrates the intersection of survival, social norms, and practicality. Infants were wrapped in swaddling clothes, often for weeks at a time. Linen shifts might be changed more frequently, but clothing and bedding were rarely washed thoroughly. Midwives practiced basic cleanliness, but understanding of germ theory was non-existent. High child mortality was in part due to these conditions, coupled with malnutrition and limited medical knowledge. Yet children adapted remarkably to these circumstances, developing resilience to parasites, infections, and other environmental challenges. By the late Middle Ages, the cumulative effect of poor hygiene began to influence public health awareness. Plague outbreaks, such as the Black Death of the mid-14th century, underscored the consequences of crowded, unsanitary conditions. Cities experimented with quarantine measures, street cleaning, and rudimentary sewage management. Even so, progress was slow, uneven, and largely reactive. The idea that daily routines, washing hands, disposing of waste properly, cleaning floors, could prevent widespread illness was only beginning to emerge. In considering all of this, it becomes clear that hygiene in the Middle Ages was not just a matter of personal choice, but a web of environmental, social, religious, and economic factors. People were constantly negotiating between what was practical, socially acceptable, and possible within their technological limitations. They faced daily compromises, small victories, and persistent challenges. They relied on ingenuity herbs to mask odors, layered clothing to extend usage, communal baths for shared cleanliness, but were limited by circumstance in ways that modern people rarely experience. And yet, even in this environment, humans adapted. They survived, communities functioned, and knowledge slowly accumulated, laying the groundwork for future improvements. But many questions remained unanswered. How did specific cities succeed or fail in managing hygiene over decades? Which practices inadvertently protected populations, and which contributed silently to the spread of disease? The answers to these questions require an even closer look at the people themselves, the routines they maintained, and the quiet innovations that sometimes went unnoticed. It is in this subtle, slow evolution, the unnoticed, almost boring details of daily life, that medieval hygiene becomes a story worth exploring. People may have struggled, complained, or improvised, but they also shaped their environments in ways that allowed human society to persist and gradually improve. And this is where the next chapter begins, examining the incremental changes, minor innovations, and persistent human ingenuity that slowly transformed medieval hygiene, setting the stage for the modern understanding of cleanliness. By the late Middle Ages, the struggle for cleanliness had become a defining, if quiet, feature of urban and rural life. In the previous sections, we explored the daily challenges of water scarcity, bathing, clothing maintenance, waste disposal, and the omnipresence of parasites. Now, it's time to see how these struggles began to shape the long-term evolution of hygiene, and how human ingenuity, incremental, repetitive, and often tedious, set the stage for future change. Let's begin with public health reforms, which emerged slowly but persistently. The Black Death of the mid-14th century was perhaps the most dramatic wake-up call. Cities that had long tolerated streets clogged with refuse, open cesspits, and polluted water sources suddenly faced catastrophic mortality. In its aftermath, urban authorities began to experiment with sanitation measures. Some towns mandated the removal of waste from streets, appointed night cleaners to sweep refuse, and issued fines for those who violated public hygiene regulations. Rivers, once indiscriminately used for disposal, became targets for controlled usage. Certain sections were reserved for washing, others strictly for transportation or drinking water. These reforms were unevenly applied and often poorly enforced, but they represent the earliest seeds of modern urban sanitation. Simultaneously, technological adaptations began to influence hygiene practices. Wells were deepened and lined with stone to reduce contamination. Rudimentary drainage systems, such as covered sewers in larger cities like Paris or Venice, began to channel waste away from populated areas. Bathhouses that had fallen out of favor due to moral concerns slowly re-emerged, sometimes incorporating improvements in heating and water turnover. Soap, though still a luxury, became more widely available in certain regions, often flavored with herbs or scented oils to encourage use. Even the mundane act of laundering garments saw gradual improvement, with more systematic methods for boiling, beating, and drying clothes. These small technical changes may seem trivial, but they represent a profound shift. The environment was being altered intentionally to make cleanliness more achievable. Social attitudes toward hygiene also evolved, though in a halting and regionally variable way. The moral anxieties surrounding public bathing persisted in some areas, but the practical benefits of cleanliness slowly gained recognition. Physicians began to note correlations between certain unsanitary conditions and disease outbreaks, even if they could not articulate the underlying microbial causes. Families, particularly wealthier households, placed increasing emphasis on frequent washing of hands, face, and even hair. Herbal remedies and scented oils continued to serve a dual purpose, masking odor and, in some cases, deterring pests. While the majority of the population still faced severe challenges, these shifting attitudes created the cultural foundation for broader hygiene improvements in the centuries to follow. Another key factor was childhood hygiene and survival strategies. As infant and child mortality remained a persistent issue, families and midwives developed practices aimed at reducing risk. Linen shifts were changed more frequently when possible. Swaddling techniques improved for airflow, and herbal remedies were applied to prevent skin irritation or infection. Though crude by modern standards, these interventions highlight the human capacity for adaptive problem solving, even in the face of chronic scarcity and risk. Children who survived to adulthood carried these practices forward, embedding incremental knowledge into daily routines. Food hygiene and storage also saw gradual, incremental improvements. People discovered that certain practices, like salting meat, smoking fish, or fermenting vegetables, reduced spoilage and disease. Market regulations began to appear, restricting the sale of visibly spoiled goods or regulating how meat was stored. Kitchens, though still smoky and crowded, were slowly modified with designated workspaces and rudimentary drainage to limit contamination. The ordinary, repetitive labor of cleaning, sorting, and preparing food became a cornerstone of survival, illustrating that even mundane tasks had outsized significance for public health. Yet, despite these gradual improvements, many challenges remained. Fleas, lice, and other parasites continued to plague the population. Rivers and wells were still contaminated intermittently. Public bathhouses, though sometimes improved, remained socially controversial. Clothing continued to harbor bacteria and insects. Hygiene was still largely dictated by circumstance, availability of water, social status, and labor capacity, and the risk of disease never disappeared entirely. Medieval people lived with constant tension between survival and cleanliness, between what was desirable and what was possible. The story of medieval hygiene also reminds us of the human capacity for resilience. People developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to live, work, and even thrive despite the persistent presence of filth, disease, and parasites. They innovated, improvised, and created incremental improvements that, while often unnoticed at the time, laid the groundwork for modern sanitation practices. Herbs were not just fragrant, they were practical. Layered clothing extended the life of textiles. Public ordinances, even poorly enforced, signaled the beginning of collective responsibility for health. Every small adaptation represented a triumph of human resourcefulness, however mundane it might have seemed. In reflecting on this history, it becomes clear that hygiene was never just a matter of personal vanity or moral obligation. It was intimately tied to survival, social order, and technological capacity. The challenges of maintaining cleanliness shaped daily life in profound ways. Where people lived, what they wore, how they ate, and even how they thought about morality and community responsibility. Everyday routines, fetching water, sweeping streets, washing clothes, bathing, were themselves acts of negotiation with a world that was often hostile to health and comfort. The legacy of medieval hygiene is both sobering and instructive. On one hand, it demonstrates the human vulnerability to environmental and social conditions. On the other, it highlights the incremental nature of historical progress. Innovations were rarely sudden or dramatic. They were small, repetitive, and often painfully tedious. Yet over centuries, these small adaptations accumulated, gradually transforming urban infrastructure, household practices, and public awareness. They remind us that history is not only made in grand battles or monumental events, it is also shaped in the quiet, repetitive labor of daily life. So, as you imagine the crowded, stinking streets of a medieval city, the communal bathhouses, the unwashed linen shifts, and the ever-present pests, remember that this world was not devoid of care or ingenuity. People lived within constraints, yet they sought ways to survive and improve. They struggled, adapted, and passed knowledge forward slowly, often boringly, but inexorably. And here's the unresolved thought that lingers as we leave this story. What might have happened if some of these incremental improvements, better sewers, cleaner water, more systematic bathing, had been widely adopted even a century earlier? Could the course of epidemics, population growth, or urban development have been dramatically different? The answer is lost to history, but pondering it reminds us that even the most mundane aspects of life, fetching water, sweeping streets, scrubbing a tunic, can have ripple effects that shape the future in ways no one could predict. The Library of Alexandria occupies a peculiar place in our collective imagination. When most people think of it, they picture a single catastrophic fire, the loss of countless scrolls in a single night, and a civilization set back centuries by a moment of carelessness. In reality, the story is far more mundane, drawn out, and, in its own way, more interesting in terms of how human institutions deal with knowledge. The library did not collapse overnight. Its decline was slow, episodic, and marked by a combination of political change, logistical challenges, and cultural shifts. To understand this slow decline, it helps first to understand its origins and ambitions. The library was founded in the Egyptian city of Alexandria, most likely during the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus in the 3rd century BCE, although some sources suggest Ptolemy I Soter played a crucial role in its conception. The Ptolemies were Greek rulers of Egypt who inherited a culturally and linguistically diverse society. Alexandria itself was a bustling port city, a crossroads of trade, ideas, and politics. The rulers of this new city wanted to establish not just political dominance, but intellectual preeminence. The library was conceived as a repository of the world's knowledge, a monumental archive where scholars could access, compare, and preserve the accumulated wisdom of previous civilizations. The logistics of this undertaking were staggering. Scrolls were acquired through multiple channels. Copies were made of works brought by visiting ships. Texts were purchased or copied from scholars, and sometimes works were borrowed under the premise of permanent addition to the collection. It is said that every book brought into Alexandria's harbour was temporarily copied, with the original often retained in the library. This relentless drive to collect and centralize knowledge was both impressive and, eventually, unwieldy. The library was less a single building than a network of institutions, including the Mausion, a sort of research institute or scholarly community, where philosophers, scientists, and librarians lived, studied, and wrote. Scholars were offered stipends, food, and housing, creating a controlled environment for intellectual activity. Despite its ambitions, the library faced practical challenges from the very beginning. Papyrus scrolls were fragile, prone to decay, and required careful storage. Alexandria's hot, humid climate posed a constant threat to preservation. Scrolls had to be kept in rooms with specific airflow, and even minor neglect could lead to irreversible damage. Librarians devoted themselves to cataloguing and maintaining these texts, a monotonous and exacting task that required skill, patience, and consistency. Even a small lapse could result in the loss of information. And over decades, these minor losses accumulated. Political instability also affected the library. Egypt was never entirely stable under the Ptolemies, and succession disputes often meant that funding for scholarly projects waxed and waned. While some rulers invested heavily in intellectual pursuits, others prioritized military campaigns, economic consolidation, or infrastructure. This uneven support meant that the library was perpetually under strain. Resources were never entirely sufficient to match its ambitions. Scholars and librarians had to improvise. They repaired scrolls with glue or stitched fragments together, copied works manually, and maintained meticulous catalogues to track the ever-growing inventory. Even routine political events could have outsized effects. Wars, riots, or shifts in city governance often disrupted the library's operations. There are accounts of portions of the collection being moved or damaged during military occupations, including Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE. While popular accounts depict this as the moment of total destruction, contemporary records suggest the damage was partial. A warehouse of scrolls may have burned, but the library as an institution continued in some form for decades afterward. The narrative of a single, catastrophic fire simplifies a far more gradual attrition of knowledge. Another factor in the library's slow collapse was cultural and intellectual shifts. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, Alexandria had become a center, not just of Greek scholarship, but of emerging Christian thought, philosophical debates, religious councils, and the changing priorities of patrons meant that the kinds of texts considered valuable were shifting. Certain works, especially pagan literature or texts, deemed irrelevant to contemporary theological debates, received less attention and were less rigorously preserved. In some cases, texts may have been intentionally destroyed, but more often, they were neglected, allowed to deteriorate, or repurposed as materials for new manuscripts. The library's decline was, in part, a reflection of changing human priorities, rather than a single act of violence or accident. Daily life in the library illustrates its mundane realities. Scholars spent long hours copying texts by hand, often sitting at wooden desks in rooms filled with the scent of papyrus and ink. Piles of scrolls were stacked meticulously, with the smallest error in labeling capable of rendering a text unfindable. Librarians conducted tedious inventories, noting the location, author, and subject of each scroll. Occasionally, visiting dignitaries or envoys brought new works, which had to be assessed, copied, and integrated into the collection. The work was painstakingly repetitive, and errors accumulated silently over decades. It was not dramatic, it was bureaucratic, labor-intensive, and slow. Yet, it was precisely this accumulation of small acts of preservation or failure to preserve that determined the library's long-term fate. Even in its decline, the library remained a center for human ingenuity. Scholars like Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth, and Hipparchus, who advanced astronomical measurement, worked with these texts. The library facilitated the incremental accumulation of knowledge. Yet, For every intellectual achievement, countless scrolls languished, unread, deteriorated, or were lost. The slow collapse was therefore a combination of environmental decay, political neglect, and changing cultural priorities. It is instructive to consider the psychology of loss here. The library's decline was imperceptible to most contemporaries. There was no single day when scholars woke up and realized that all knowledge was gone. Instead, texts disappeared one by one, lost in the shuffle of administration, miscatalogued, or physically destroyed by accident. From a modern perspective, it feels catastrophic. From a medieval perspective, it may have seemed almost inevitable, a minor nuisance mitigated by new acquisitions or replacements. Knowledge itself was understood as somewhat transient, vulnerable to the passage of time, and dependent on human stewardship. And yet, even as the library's collections thinned, the ideas it preserved spread. Copies of texts had already traveled to other centers: Greek scholars in Constantinople, Roman libraries, and eventually Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba received fragments of these works. The library's slow collapse, while tragic in its incompleteness, was not total. Its influence persisted quietly through the transmission of ideas, through copies and citations, in ways that historians would only piece together centuries later. By the end of this section, it is clear that the Library of Alexandria was never a single building that burned in a night of infamy. Its collapse was gradual, bureaucratic, and mundane, shaped by the slow erosion of scrolls, shifting cultural priorities, political instability, and logistical challenges of preservation. This slow attrition raises a deeper question. How much knowledge have humans lost silently over the centuries? Not through dramatic events, but through the quiet, tedious decay of paper, ink, and memory. The library's story challenges the common narrative of sudden catastrophe. It reminds us that history is often shaped not by dramatic moments alone, but by the accumulation of small, almost boring failures in everyday systems. Cataloging errors, neglected scrolls, unheated storage rooms, inattentive librarians. It forces us to think about how fragile knowledge can be, and how much of human intellectual history has slipped away without anyone noticing. And as we leave this first section of the library's decline, one unresolved thought remains. If preservation had been prioritized more effectively, how different might our understanding of ancient science, philosophy, and literature be today? Could entire schools of thought have survived, or would new challenges have rendered them irrelevant regardless? The slow collapse of knowledge, it seems, is a story of both human ambition and human limitation, played out not in heroic battles, but in quiet rooms filled with dust, ink, and the relentless passage of time. As we step further into the story of the Library of Alexandria, it becomes increasingly clear that its decline was less the result of a single cataclysm and more a gradual unraveling of human systems, priorities, and practical realities. In Section 1, we trace the library's origins, its monumental ambitions, and the slow attrition of its scrolls. Now, we turn to the intricate interplay of politics, economics, culture, and human behavior that compounded the challenges of preservation, revealing just how fragile even the most extraordinary human institutions can be. The library existed within the broader context of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek ruling family attempting to consolidate power in a culturally and linguistically diverse Egypt. The dynasty's fortunes fluctuated with political intrigues, wars, and succession crises. Scholars in the library were not entirely insulated from these events. Funding for their work could be generous under one ruler and vanish under another. This instability had practical consequences. Repairs to buildings might be delayed, storage facilities neglected, and staff salaries reduced. Scholars depended on the state for housing, food, and stipends, so political instability could directly undermine the maintenance of the collection. Even more subtly, the library's slow collapse was influenced by economic pressures. Papyrus, the primary medium for writing, was imported from Upper Egypt, transported along the Nile, and sold at a significant cost. Every scroll required labor-intensive copying, binding, and storage. Maintaining a collection of hundreds of thousands of scrolls demanded constant expenditure. When wars disrupted trade routes or drained the treasury, acquisitions slowed, and existing scrolls were sometimes cannibalized to supply materials for new copies. Economic scarcity meant that preservation, which requires constant care and attention, was often deprioritized. Cultural shifts further complicated the library's survival. Alexandria was a cosmopolitan city, a meeting point of Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and later Roman populations. Each group valued different texts, and the library had to navigate competing intellectual priorities. Works of Greek philosophy and science were highly prized, but texts in Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hebrew, or other languages were sometimes neglected or dismissed. Religious authorities increasingly gained influence over civic priorities, and by the later centuries, Christian perspectives began to dominate the cultural landscape. Texts considered pagan or irrelevant to emerging theological concerns were more likely to fall into neglect. In this way, the slow attrition of scrolls was as much ideological as it was accidental. Some knowledge was deliberately de-emphasized, even ignored, by those who curated the collection. The physical environment of the library itself also contributed to its gradual decay. Alexandria's climate, hot, humid, and prone to flooding in low-lying areas, was unforgiving to papyrus scrolls. Insects, mold, and dust were constant threats. Rooms needed to be ventilated, yet secure and dry. Librarians faced a delicate balancing act, protecting scrolls from moisture while ensuring that air could circulate enough to prevent mold. The daily maintenance required to sustain even a portion of the collection was extraordinary. Dusting, rotating scrolls, repairing torn edges, and cataloging each item meticulously. Even minor lapses could result in irrecoverable loss. The human element was critical. Scholars and librarians were highly trained, but their work was painstaking and repetitive. Copying scrolls could take months for a single text, and errors inevitably crept in. Cataloging was an exacting task. Each scroll had to be recorded, labeled, and shelved in the proper location. Misplaced texts could vanish for decades, if not forever. Scholars relied heavily on the diligence of librarians, yet fatigue, human error, and administrative lapses meant that losses were inevitable. Over centuries, these seemingly minor mistakes accumulated. A quiet erosion of knowledge, rather than a spectacular fire. One particular example of political interference occurred during Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE. Caesar's forces engaged in a battle within the city, and according to some accounts, warehouses holding scrolls were set on fire. While dramatic in legend, contemporary evidence suggests that the destruction affected a portion of the library's holdings rather than the entirety. Even so, the fire disrupted the meticulous routines of cataloging, copying, and storage. Scrolls that survived might have been scattered, relocated, or neglected, further accelerating decay. Intellectual ambition itself contributed to the library's vulnerability. The Ptolemies' goal of collecting all knowledge created logistical pressure. Thousands of scrolls arrived from distant lands, sometimes faster than they could be properly catalogued or stored. Scholars were required to produce copies quickly, creating a backlog that risked damage or loss. The pressure to acquire new texts sometimes came at the expense of preserving existing ones. In other words, the library's ambition, its desire to hold the sum total of human knowledge, was in tension with the practical limitations of human labor, materials, and environment. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, Alexandria had changed again. Roman governance introduced new administrative structures, tax systems, and civic priorities. The city remained a hub of trade and learning, but scholarly institutions were less insulated than under the Ptolemies. Religious debates, particularly as Christianity gained dominance, influenced which texts were considered worth preserving. Pagan texts were gradually neglected. Their storage conditions deteriorated, and some were repurposed for practical uses, such as being recycled for writing materials. Knowledge that once seemed indispensable became invisible, slowly fading from memory. Even in decline, the library had lasting influence. Scholars like Hypatia, who lived in the 4th and early 5th centuries CE, drew upon texts preserved there to advance mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Copies of scrolls had already traveled beyond Alexandria to Rome, Constantinople, and eventually the Islamic world, seeding intellectual growth elsewhere. The slow collapse, while tragic for the central repository, did not entirely extinguish the ideas it held. Its influence survived in dispersed fragments, transmitted incrementally through copying, translation, and commentary. What is remarkable about the library's story is how it highlights the fragility of human systems. Knowledge can be vulnerable not only to catastrophic events, but also to the ordinary challenges of bureaucracy, environment, economics, and shifting cultural values. Its decline teaches us that preservation requires constant, deliberate effort, attention to mundane details, and an awareness of changing contexts. For every dramatic tale of lost scrolls, there are centuries of quiet erosion, incremental neglect, and small human errors that together result in loss. And yet, even amid decline, the library demonstrated human resilience and ingenuity. Scholars and librarians adapted to shortages, developed new cataloging methods, repaired damaged scrolls, and attempted to transmit knowledge to other regions. They did not witness a single catastrophic destruction. Rather, they participated in a slow struggle to maintain continuity in the face of overwhelming logistical, political, and environmental challenges. By the end of this section, the story invites a deeper question. Could the library's decline have been reversed if its custodians had anticipated political and cultural changes? Or was the slow attrition of knowledge inevitable in a world without modern preservation technology and communication networks? The next section will explore the final stages of the library's collapse, its ultimate disappearance, and the lessons it offers about how societies value, protect, and sometimes lose knowledge over time. The final chapter of the Library of Alexandria is, in many ways, the quietest yet most profound. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, the library had already passed the peak of its ambition. Its scrolls, once carefully curated and meticulously catalogued, had been scattered, neglected, or destroyed. Political instability, cultural shifts, and practical challenges had all played their part. Unlike dramatic stories of fire or conquest, the library's demise was slow, episodic, and, in its own way, almost mundane, but no less significant. We begin by considering religious and cultural pressures. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had become the dominant force in Alexandria. Pagan temples were closed, and the intellectual priorities of the city shifted. Texts that had once been central to scholarship works of Greek philosophy, pagan theology, and even scientific treatises were increasingly neglected. Some may have been intentionally destroyed or repurposed, while others simply deteriorated due to lack of care. The library, as an institution, lost its political and social patronage. Without steady support, preservation became impossible. The final stages of decay were likely imperceptible to most contemporaries. Scholars and librarians who remained continued their work, but they faced a shrinking collection and limited resources. Scrolls were miscatalogued, torn, or eaten by insects. Buildings housing the collection suffered from neglect or were repurposed. The institution may have persisted nominally, but its function as a centralized repository of world knowledge had effectively ended. Unlike the popular myth of a single burning, the loss occurred incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. It is in this gradual disappearance that we glimpse the library's broader lessons about human institutions. Knowledge, no matter how grandly collected or carefully preserved, is vulnerable to the passage of time, environmental hazards, and changing human priorities. Even the most ambitious projects are fragile without sustained support, and preservation requires constant attention to the smallest details. Misplaced scrolls, damp storage rooms, or bureaucratic neglect can quietly erase centuries of human achievement, long before a dramatic disaster occurs. Yet, paradoxically, the library's legacy did not vanish entirely. Even as Alexandria's central repository disappeared, its influence persisted through dispersion. Copies of scrolls had already traveled to Rome, Constantinople, and later the Islamic world, seeding libraries and intellectual centers across continents. Scholars such as Hypatia drew upon surviving texts to advance mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Many ideas survived in fragments, citations, or translations. The library's ambition to collect the world's knowledge ensured that even its slow collapse had ripple effects far beyond Alexandria itself. Knowledge, it turns out, is remarkably resilient, even when institutions are fragile. The library's story also highlights the interplay of human ambition and limitation. The Ptolemies dreamed of preserving all knowledge, but practical constraints, fragile materials, environmental hazards, labor-intensive copying, and political volatility ensured that some loss was inevitable. The slow collapse illustrates the tension between aspiration and reality. It reminds us that even the most extraordinary human endeavors are subject to mundane constraints. Dust, moisture, misfiled scrolls, and the relentless march of time. We can also consider the human dimension. The scholars, scribes, and librarians who lived and worked there. Their lives were shaped by routine, repetition, and painstaking labor. Copying scrolls, cataloging texts, repairing damaged papyrus, and supervising apprentices were repetitive, often thankless tasks. They did not live through a single dramatic catastrophe. They experienced decades of incremental loss, witnessing knowledge vanish in small, almost imperceptible steps. Their perseverance in the face of environmental decay and political uncertainty is a testament to human resilience, even when the work is monotonous and largely invisible to posterity. Finally, the story of the library invites reflection on the fragility and value of knowledge itself. Consider this: every civilization depends on the preservation of texts, records, and observations. What we take for granted today, libraries, archives, digital storage, emerged from centuries of trial and error. The Library of Alexandria reminds us that knowledge is never permanent. It exists only through human effort. Every era risks losing wisdom to neglect, decay, or shifting priorities. Yet the persistence of ideas, even in fragmentary form, shows that human intellect finds ways to endure. The unresolved question that haunts the library's legacy is compelling. How many discoveries, innovations, or philosophical insights were lost forever because they resided solely in scrolls that crumbled in Alexandria? And conversely, how much did the survival of just a few texts shape the course of civilization in ways we cannot fully measure? In the end, the Library of Alexandria is not merely a story of loss. It is a story of ambition, resilience, and the quiet, repetitive labor of generations of scholars. Its collapse teaches a subtle but enduring lesson. The survival of knowledge depends not on dramatic events, but on continuous, often invisible care. Even when institutions fail, ideas persist, travel, and transform, demonstrating that the human drive to understand, record, and preserve knowledge cannot be entirely extinguished. So as you imagine the library scrolls stacked high, scholars bent over ink-stained papyrus, dusty catalogues slowly fading, you can see both tragedy and triumph. Its slow collapse reminds us that history is not only shaped by moments of violence or disaster, but also by the mundane, everyday efforts to preserve, protect, and transmit human understanding. Salt. It seems simple, even boring, a white mineral used to flavor food and preserve it. Yet in the medieval world, salt was far more than a seasoning. It was a commodity of extraordinary importance, a driver of trade, a source of political power, and a key to human survival. Its influence extended quietly into the rhythms of daily life, the fortunes of towns, and the strategic decisions of kings. To understand the medieval economy, one must begin with salt, because without it, food spoiled, armies could not march, and entire regions could face hunger and economic collapse. The story begins with the practical necessity of salt. Before refrigeration, Salt was essential for preserving meat, fish, and other perishables. Salting drew out moisture, inhibiting bacterial growth, and allowed communities to store food for months. In a world where winter meant scarcity, salted provisions could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Fish, particularly herring and cod, were abundant in northern Europe, but had to be preserved for transport inland. Salt made that possible. Similarly, salted pork, beef, and cheese could feed both towns and armies, sustaining populations during hard seasons. Salt's importance gave it immense economic value. It was traded across long distances, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles from coastal saltworks or inland mines to distant markets. Cities like Venice, Marseille, and Lüneburg became hubs in the salt trade, and their fortunes depended on controlling access to this essential mineral. Merchants transported it via carts, boats, and pack animals, often in quantities heavy enough to make transportation itself a major logistical challenge. Roads, bridges, and river ports were developed or improved to facilitate salt movement. Even tolls, tariffs, and customs duties were often based on the salt trade, reflecting its economic centrality. Political authorities quickly realized the power inherent in salt control. Kings and local lords imposed monopolies, regulated production, and taxed salt heavily. The French gabelle, a tax on salt introduced in the 13th century, became infamous for its burdensome enforcement, ultimately contributing to social unrest centuries later. Salt taxes were lucrative because almost everyone needed salt, and avoiding the tax was difficult. Governments could leverage salt control to finance wars, build infrastructure, or maintain authority over distant territories. In some regions, armies marched with salt as a rationed commodity, not just as a food preservative, but as a measure of political power. Salt also shaped the geography of medieval towns. Settlements often arose near salt sources, whether coastal salt pans, brine springs, or rock salt deposits. Towns such as Salzburg in Austria or Wieliczka in Poland were directly tied to salt production and trade. Local economies depended on mining, processing, and transporting the mineral, creating employment and supporting ancillary industries like cartwrights, stonemasons, and merchants. Entire communities were oriented around the seasonal rhythms of salt harvesting, with labor-intensive work often dictated by tides, evaporation rates, or the availability of miners. Beyond economics, salt influenced diet and nutrition. People were aware that salt was necessary for taste, preservation, and even health. Though not in the detailed way, modern science understands electrolytes. Meals in towns and castles alike relied on salted meat, fish, and cheese as staples. Without salt, fresh foods would spoil quickly, leading to foodborne illnesses and malnutrition. In colder climates, where winter meant months without fresh produce, salt-preserved food was essential for survival. It created a quiet, constant dependency on a mineral that most people today consider trivial. The trade and transportation of salt were far from simple. Roads in medieval Europe were often rudimentary, muddy in the winter, and dangerous due to bandits. Rivers offered an alternative, but only where navigable. Caravans transporting salt faced delays, losses, and theft, and merchants had to factor these risks into pricing. Salt was heavy, and moving it required careful logistical planning. Sometimes it was traded for other essentials, grain, cloth, or livestock, embedding it deeply into the broader medieval economy. Even the labor involved in salt production was monotonous but vital. Coastal saltworks relied on evaporating seawater in shallow pans, a process highly dependent on climate. Workers had to rake, dry, and store the crystallized salt, often under harsh sun or during freezing winters. Inland salt mines were dangerous and physically demanding, requiring miners to extract rock salt, transport it through narrow tunnels, and process it into usable forms. This work, repetitive and exhausting, was nonetheless indispensable for the functioning of towns, armies, and markets. Salt also subtly affected political alliances and conflicts. Wars were not fought solely for land or prestige. Control of salt routes or mines could be strategically crucial. Armies marched to protect or seize salt-producing regions, and access to salt often influenced the outcome of sieges or campaigns. Cities with abundant salt had leverage in trade negotiations, while those dependent on imported salt were vulnerable to embargoes, blockades, or price manipulation. Moreover, salt left traces on cultural and religious life. It appeared in rituals, symbolizing purity or preservation, and was sometimes used in oaths or ceremonies. The seemingly mundane act of salting food intersected with symbolism, commerce, and survival, creating layers of significance that went far beyond flavoring meals. Despite its importance, the supply of salt was never entirely secure. Bad weather, political disruption, or local conflict could interrupt production. Shortages were deeply felt. Spoiled food, starvation, and economic disruption followed quickly. The precarious nature of supply made salt a commodity that demanded attention, management, and careful oversight. Its value was constant, yet its availability was uncertain, embedding salt into the rhythms of life, labor, and governance. And yet, the influence of salt is often overlooked in popular history. It is boring in the sense that it is mundane, white crystals on a table, but its impact was profound. Entire economies, towns, and empires relied on it. Daily life, from what people ate to how armies survived, depended on this mineral. Salt was a linchpin in the medieval world, quiet yet essential, shaping human activity in ways so fundamental that we rarely notice. Even now, reflecting on the slow rhythms of its production, trade, and taxation, one can imagine the daily labor and small routines that kept the medieval economy functioning. Miners descending into dark shafts, workers raking salt pans under the sun, merchants negotiating tolls along rivers, bakers and butchers depending on preserved ingredients, and townsfolk carefully rationing their supplies. The story of salt is, at its core, the story of countless ordinary acts of human diligence and survival. And yet, one question remains unresolved. How might European society have developed differently if salt had been less scarce, less controlled, or more easily preserved? Would trade routes have shifted? Would towns have flourished in different regions? Could wars and alliances have taken entirely different forms? The answer, like much of economic history, lies hidden in the mundane details of everyday life. The labor of miners, the routes of carts, the policies of kings, and the simple need to preserve food. Salt, seemingly ordinary, quietly shaped the course of medieval Europe, proving that even the most mundane substances can wield extraordinary influence. The story of salt in medieval Europe extends far beyond its culinary use. It was a commodity that quietly shaped economies, determined political power, and influenced daily life in ways that were rarely noticed at the time. In Section 1, we explored its basic necessity for food preservation, its labor-intensive production, and its role as a driver of trade. Now we examine the ripple effects of salt control, taxation, and distribution, and how these boring economic details shaped the medieval world in profound ways. One of the most significant effects of salt was its influence on trade networks. Unlike grain, which could be grown in many regions, salt production was geographically limited. Coastal salt pans and inland mines were concentrated in specific areas. For instance, the Rhone Valley in France, Lüneburg in Germany, and the Wieliczka mines in Poland. This scarcity created natural trade routes. Salt caravans moved along rivers, over mountain passes, and across plains to reach regions that lacked local supplies. Towns along these routes, whether trading posts, river ports, or market towns, thrived economically, serving as hubs for merchants, artisans, and laborers. The movement of salt created a predictable rhythm of commerce, tying distant communities together in a network that depended entirely on this mineral. Trade, however, was tightly regulated. Salt was considered a strategic resource, and governments recognized its potential as a source of revenue. Monarchs and lords often imposed monopolies or taxes. In France, the gabelle became one of the most hated fiscal burdens in the kingdom. By requiring everyone to purchase a certain amount of salt from official sources at fixed prices, the Crown created a stable revenue stream, but also resentment, smuggling, and illicit markets. Similar practices occurred elsewhere. Rulers controlled who could harvest or sell salt, and breaches of these rules could be harshly punished. The enforcement of these regulations required bureaucratic oversight, further embedding salt into the machinery of governance. Salt's economic significance extended to labor organization and social hierarchies. In mining towns, workers were often bound to the salt works through obligations or contracts, creating quasi-feudal relationships. These laborers performed repetitive, physically demanding tasks: digging shafts, hauling rock salt, raking evaporated salt pans, and transporting heavy sacks to markets. Their lives were dictated by the seasonal rhythms of production, climate conditions, and transportation schedules. In coastal regions, workers had to time salt harvesting with the tides and sun, ensuring the evaporation process proceeded correctly. In both cases, salt production created structured, often monotonous work that supported entire local economies. Even beyond economics and labor, salt had subtle influences on politics and military strategy. Armies relied on preserved food, and without salt, campaigns were limited in duration and reach. Strategic control of salt-producing regions could determine the success or failure of military expeditions. During sieges, controlling salt supplies was as important as controlling water or weapons, because the defenders needed salted provisions to withstand prolonged isolation. Salt also played a role in diplomacy. Securing trade agreements or access to salt routes could strengthen alliances, while embargoes or restrictions could weaken adversaries. These quiet, logistical considerations often dictated political outcomes as much as battles did. Salt shaped urban and rural economies in other, less obvious ways. Towns near production sites often became wealthy, while those reliant on imported salt were vulnerable to fluctuations in price or supply. Merchants who controlled distribution profited handsomely, investing in warehouses, transport infrastructure, and storage facilities. Inland towns sometimes imposed local regulations to ensure fair distribution or prevent hoarding, highlighting the integration of salt into civic planning. In rural areas, peasants depended on salt to preserve food through the winter. Without adequate salt, they faced spoilage and malnutrition, making this mineral a vital aspect of survival. The cultural significance of salt should not be overlooked. Salt appeared in religious rituals, symbolizing purity, preservation, and covenant. Churches used salt in baptisms and other rites, while households incorporated it into everyday practices for health and protection. Symbolically, salt's permanence contrasted with the fleeting nature of other resources. It preserved food, safeguarded health, and, metaphorically, offered stability in a world prone to scarcity and disruption. Salt was also central to the medieval diet. In towns and castles, meals were rarely fresh. Bread, cheese, salted meat, and preserved fish formed staples. Without salt, protein could not be stored safely, and famine or illness would quickly follow. Households carefully rationed salt, distributing it for cooking, preservation, and sometimes trading it for other necessities. This dependence made the mineral an everyday concern, quietly structuring domestic life, labor, and food consumption in ways that modern readers might find mundane, but were existentially crucial at the time. The interconnectedness of salt and money further amplified its importance. Salt was so valuable that it could function as currency. In some contexts, debts were sometimes paid in salt, and tolls could be collected in sacks of the mineral. Coins minted near salt-producing regions often referenced the industry, acknowledging the centrality of salt to the local economy. Its movement created a predictable flow of wealth, linking production centers with urban markets, regional authorities, and even international trade networks. Yet, despite its centrality, salt remained fragile and unpredictable. Harvests could fail due to weather, transportation could be disrupted by bandits or poor roads, and political turmoil could restrict access. Shortages had immediate consequences. Food spoiled, trade slowed, and populations faced hunger. Maintaining a stable supply required careful planning, constant labor, and bureaucratic oversight. The mundane, repetitive tasks raking salt pans, hauling sacks, supervising storage were essential to sustaining the economy. Without attention to these boring details, entire regions risked collapse. And here, as Section 2 concludes, one subtle but provocative question emerges. If salt had been more abundant, or if governments had chosen different policies regarding taxation and monopoly, how might medieval economies and political power have evolved differently? Would cities like Venice or Lüneburg have been less influential? Would wars have been shorter or longer? Could entire trade networks have developed along different lines? Salt, seemingly ordinary and mundane, quietly structured the medieval world in ways that touch every aspect of life, from food and labor to politics and economics. Its story is not one of grand battles or heroic figures, but of small, repetitive human actions, the organization of labor, and the careful management of a resource so essential that society itself depended upon it. By the late Middle Ages, salt had secured its place as one of the most quietly transformative forces in European society. In sections 1 and 2, we traced its essential role in food preservation, its labor-intensive production, its influence on trade, taxation, and political power, and its subtle presence in everyday life. Now, we examine the long-term consequences of salt on medieval society and reflect on its enduring legacy. The first major consequence of salt was its shaping of economic hierarchies and urban development. Towns that controlled salt production or trade flourished. Lüneburg in northern Germany became wealthy on the back of its mines, while Salzburg in Austria literally derived its name, Salt Castle, from its mineral wealth. These towns invested in infrastructure, warehouses for storage, roads for transport, bridges for trade. Economic activity clustered around salt production and distribution, creating employment not only in mining, but in ancillary industries such as transport, metallurgy, and commerce. Wealth generated by salt enabled towns to finance walls, markets, and civic buildings, providing a foundation for urban growth and security. Salt also reinforced social hierarchies. Those who controlled production and distribution, whether local lords, merchants, or city authorities, held disproportionate power. Access to salt was not universal. Poorer communities often relied on local sources or had to purchase limited quantities at regulated prices. Monarchs leveraged salt monopolies and taxes to consolidate power, fund armies, and maintain administrative control. The gabelle in France, introduced in the 13th century, exemplifies how a mundane substance could become a tool of governance and a source of deep social tension. Rebellions and smuggling networks arose in response to the perceived unfairness of salt taxation, highlighting the mineral's role in both stability and unrest. Salt's influence extended to military logistics and strategy. Armies could march only as far as their supplies allowed, and salt-preserved food was essential for sustaining troops on long campaigns. Strategic control of salt-producing regions often determined the success of sieges or territorial conquests. Commanders planned routes, stockpiled provisions, and protected supply lines, knowing that the absence of salt could cripple an army even more effectively than enemy forces. In this sense, the mineral quietly shaped the outcomes of conflicts, influencing the course of history without ever appearing on a battlefield. Another significant impact was on diet, nutrition, and public health. Salt was central to preserving protein, enabling communities to survive harsh winters, famine, or transport over long distances. It allowed the storage of meat, fish, cheese, and other essentials, reducing spoilage and foodborne illness. Salt intake also had physiological benefits, preventing deficiencies that could affect muscle function and survival. In these mundane ways, the mineral became a cornerstone of public health, an invisible yet essential support system for medieval populations. Salt also shaped international trade and cultural exchange. As merchants transported salt across regions, they carried ideas, technologies, and customs along with it. Trade networks connected coastal and inland communities, creating channels for economic and cultural transmission. Salt fairs, markets, and guilds facilitated interactions that went beyond commerce, influencing clothing, tools, and even artistic practices. In this way, salt acted as both commodity and vector, silently linking disparate parts of medieval Europe into a coherent economic and social system. Yet, despite its importance, salt remained a constant source of tension and fragility. Shortages due to weather, poor harvests, or political disruption could trigger crises. Smuggling, black markets, and rebellion were inevitable responses to scarcity or taxation. The same mineral that enabled urban prosperity and military campaigns could also destabilize regions when mismanaged. This duality underscores the mundane yet pivotal nature of salt. It was neither dramatic nor conspicuous, yet everything depended upon it. The legacy of salt extends beyond the medieval period. By structuring trade, labor, urban development, and political power, it helped create the foundation for modern European economies. Many towns that prospered through salt trade evolved into significant urban centers. Taxation policies developed around salt-informed fiscal systems that persisted for centuries. The mundane routines of salt miners, merchants, and householders harvesting, transporting, salting meat, and rationing supplies echo in the structures of modern economic and social organization. Reflecting on this, one recognizes a profound truth about history. The seemingly boring or ordinary often has far-reaching consequences. Salt was not glamorous, dramatic, or heroic. It did not inspire epic battles in the popular imagination. Yet it shaped survival, wealth, power, and daily life across Europe. Without it, armies would have faltered, towns might never have thrived, and ordinary households would have struggled to survive. Its quiet influence underscores that the mundane, small, repetitive, practical human actions can steer the course of history just as effectively as wars, conquests, or revolutions. And so, the unresolved reflection remains: how many other, seemingly ordinary substances, spices, metals, water, or even tools have silently directed the trajectory of human civilization, their influence hidden in the daily routines of labor, trade, and survival? And what might we be overlooking in our own era, assuming that mundane systems have little historical significance? The story of salt reminds us to look closely at the ordinary, to consider the quiet labor and repetitive routines that sustain societies, and to appreciate that history is often written not only in epic events, but in the invisible currents of necessity, survival, and human ingenuity. If you think of medieval medicine, the image that often comes to mind is a heroic physician in a flowing robe, tending to patients with wisdom and care. The reality, however, was far less comforting. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a complex mixture of tradition, superstition, and practical observation, often performed under conditions that would be considered dangerously unhygienic by modern standards. Understanding it requires examining not only the theories that guided practitioners, but also the everyday realities of treatment, the labor of caregiving, and the constant interplay between survival and risk. The foundation of medieval medicine rested heavily on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was understood as a balance among these humours, and disease as an imbalance. Physicians diagnosed patients by examining urine, blood, and other bodily fluids, observing their colour, consistency, and even smell. This was not simply superstition. It represented a systematic attempt to categorize human physiology based on observable patterns. Yet the treatments derived from this theory, bloodletting, purging, and the use of strong herbal concoctions, were often hazardous, especially when performed repeatedly or by inexperienced practitioners. Hospitals and care centers in the Middle Ages were vastly different from modern institutions. Large urban hospitals existed in cities like Paris, Florence, and London, but many were affiliated with religious orders and primarily served the poor or travelers. Sanitation was minimal, and overcrowding was common. Beds were simple wooden frames or straw-filled mattresses, often shared by multiple patients. Linen was changed infrequently, and waste disposal was rudimentary. In such environments, infections spread easily, and minor wounds could become fatal. Caring for patients was a daily, exhausting, and sometimes dangerous task for nurses and attendants, who were constantly exposed to illness, without the protection we now take for granted. Everyday medical practices reflected the tension between empirical observation and superstition. Physicians and apothecaries relied on herbal remedies, minerals, and animal products. Willow bark, for example, contained compounds that we now know act as painkillers. However, treatments were often mixed with ingredients that could be harmful in themselves. Mercury, arsenic, or lead were not uncommon. These substances were administered in the belief that they restored balance to the humors or expelled disease-causing toxins. The repetition of these treatments, boiling herbs, mixing powders, applying ointments, was meticulous and labor-intensive. Yet the results were inconsistent and sometimes deadly. The role of surgery was particularly perilous. Barbers and surgeons often overlapped in their duties, performing minor operations such as tooth extractions, wound drainage, and lancing abscesses. Tools were rarely sterilized, and anesthesia, as we know it, did not exist. Patients endured pain through physical restraint, alcohol, or herbal sedatives. Infection was rampant, and post-operative care was largely trial and error. Even skilled practitioners faced high mortality rates among patients, which reflected not only the state of knowledge, but also the limitations of materials, hygiene, and supportive care. Medical education was uneven. Universities began to formalize training in places like Bologna and Montpellier during the 12th and 13th centuries. But access was limited, and much knowledge was derived from ancient texts, particularly the works of Galen and Hippocrates. These texts were authoritative, but imperfect, and their application in a practical, resource-limited environment often produced risky outcomes. Apprenticeships and hands-on experience supplemented theory, but the results were inconsistent, and patients often suffered as a consequence. Everyday life and preventive measures played a surprisingly large role in survival, often more so than active treatment. People relied on diet, exercise, bathing practices, and environmental hygiene to maintain health. Herb gardens, spices, and fermented foods were used not only for flavor, but for perceived medicinal properties. Clean water was prized, but often scarce. Wells and rivers could be contaminated, yet communities developed rudimentary filtration and boiling practices to reduce risk. Folk remedies, charms, and rituals provided psychological comfort, and in a world with limited options, the boundary between medicine and superstition was often blurred. The social context of medicine added further complexity. Access to skilled practitioners depended on wealth, location, and social standing. Urban elites might afford trained physicians, apothecaries, and private care, while rural populations relied on midwives, herbalists, or local healers. The labor of caregiving, fetching water, preparing herbal remedies, maintaining cleanliness, and assisting with mobility was often performed by women and low-status attendants, whose efforts were critical but largely invisible. In this sense, survival often depended less on medical theory and more on sustained, repetitive care in everyday life. Epidemics amplified these challenges. Plagues, fevers, and recurring outbreaks of smallpox or dysentery created overwhelming demand for medical attention. Hospitals filled beyond capacity, staff were overworked, and treatment was largely supportive rather than curative. Physicians could diagnose symptoms, but often lacked effective interventions, while communities improvised quarantine measures, ritual purification, and herbal remedies. The dangers of medieval medicine were not limited to experimental treatments. Simply being in a hospital or near the sick could expose one to deadly pathogens. Even mundane tasks, washing hands, handling bedding, or cooking meals for patients were critical to survival, but poorly understood in germ-theoretical terms. Yet human ingenuity persisted. Families and caregivers developed routines for cleaning, isolating the ill, and preparing herbal poultices. Repetition, observation, and adaptation allowed incremental improvements in survival, even if the underlying causes of disease remained a mystery. By the end of this section, it is clear that medieval medicine was simultaneously practical, dangerous, and essential. Physicians and healers operated under serious constraints, relying on observation, tradition, and trial and error. Everyday acts of care, washing, tending wounds, preparing remedies, were as vital to survival as the more dramatic interventions like surgery or bloodletting. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a delicate balance between knowledge, labor, and risk. And yet, one unresolved thought lingers. Given the inherent dangers and limitations of medieval medical practices, how did communities develop resilience and strategies to survive epidemics, injuries, and chronic illness without modern understanding of germs or sterile procedures? Were survival rates more dependent on routine care and lifestyle than on the dramatic treatments administered by physicians? In the previous section, we explored the precarious foundations of medieval medicine, the humoral theory, the hazards of surgery, and the vital, yet often invisible labor of caregivers. Now, we look more closely at how medical practices evolved over time, how hospitals attempted to systematize care, and how the survival of patients often depended on mundane routines rather than dramatic interventions. By the 12th and 13th centuries, medical education and knowledge networks had begun to formalize. Universities such as Bologna, Montpellier, and Salerno offered structured courses in medicine, drawing upon classical texts from Galen, Hippocrates, and later Arabic scholars like Avicenna. Students learned anatomy through textual study rather than dissection, since dissection was often prohibited or rare. Clinical practice involved observing patients and assisting senior physicians, which was a slow and sometimes dangerous method of learning. Errors were inevitable. Overdoses, misdiagnoses, and harmful interventions were common. Yet incremental improvements in theory and practice accumulated over time. The hospital system was evolving alongside universities. Though it remained primitive by modern standards, urban hospitals served multiple roles: care for the sick, housing for travelers, and charitable support for the poor. Monastic hospitals emphasized cleanliness and prayer, creating an environment where routine care, washing, feeding, and turning patients was prioritized over aggressive treatments. These repetitive, often monotonous tasks were the backbone of patient survival. Even without understanding pathogens, caregivers learned through experience that attention to hygiene, diet, and rest reduced mortality. In many ways, survival depended more on these mundane routines than on surgical skill or medicinal expertise. At the same time, surgical practice remained hazardous but slowly more specialized. Barbers and surgeons often performed extractions, amputations, and cauterizations. Tools were sharpened and sterilized as best as possible using boiling water or alcohol, but these methods were inconsistent. Pain management relied on alcohol, opium, or herbal sedatives, and patients often endured procedures while restrained. Mortality remained high, yet surgeons gradually learned to minimize infection through careful wound care, cleaning instruments, and covering injuries. Even these small procedural improvements reflected centuries of repetitive observation and adjustment rather than a single scientific breakthrough. The use of medicinal herbs and chemical compounds illustrates the dual nature of medieval medicine, simultaneously practical and dangerous. Willow bark, honey, garlic, and other substances were effective for pain relief, antibacterial support, or wound dressing. Conversely, mercury, arsenic, and lead were common in treatments, especially for chronic ailments, fevers, or skin conditions. Physicians relied on dosing manuals derived from classical texts, but miscalculations could easily poison patients. The repetitive, laborious preparation of remedies, grinding, boiling, mixing, and applying required care, patience, and observation. A single careless measurement could undo weeks of effort. Epidemics were a particular challenge. Outbreaks of plague, smallpox, and dysentery overwhelmed hospitals and communities. Physicians often had little more than supportive care to offer: herbs, poultices, and drainage of fluids. Yet, communities adapted through quarantine measures, isolation of the sick, and hygienic routines, such as changing bedding and cleaning living spaces. These mundane practices, repeated tirelessly day after day, likely saved more lives than the dramatic treatments that dominate historical imagination. The labor of countless caregivers, often women and low-status attendants, created a quiet network of survival. One overlooked aspect of medieval medicine was preventive care and lifestyle guidance. Physicians advised patients on diet, exercise, and sleep to maintain humoral balance. Bathing, once considered morally suspect in some periods, was nevertheless encouraged when feasible for hygiene and overall health. Midwives, herbalists, and household caregivers passed down knowledge about childbirth, infant care, and wound treatment, forming an informal but vital system of community-based medicine. Again, it was repetitive attention to daily routines that often determined survival. Medicine was also deeply social and economic. Access to skilled care depended on wealth and status. Urban elites could afford physicians and apothecaries. Rural populations relied on midwives, local healers, and herbalists. Hospitals provided basic support for the poor, but resources were limited. The labor of caregiving, fetching water, preparing food and medicine, turning patients in bed, and cleaning wounds was invisible but critical. Human effort, more than theory, often decided life or death. Cultural beliefs continued to shape medical practice. Astrology influenced diagnosis and treatment. The alignment of stars dictated when bloodletting or surgery was appropriate. Superstition mingled with observation. Charms, amulets, and prayers accompanied herbal remedies. This combination may seem irrational today, yet it represented an attempt to organize understanding and control over the unpredictable forces of disease and mortality. By the end of this section, it becomes evident that medieval medicine was a slow evolution of trial and error, anchored in repetitive, mundane practices. Hospitals, caregivers, and communities collectively adapted routines that increased survival, even in the absence of germ theory or modern sterilization. The dangers of surgery, toxic remedies, and superstitious treatments were balanced by the quiet efficacy of daily care, preventive measures, and practical wisdom. Yet one unresolved question remains. If daily care, hygiene, and community-based interventions were more crucial to survival than dramatic treatments, how might our modern understanding of medicine underestimate the importance of these repetitive, invisible practices in shaping human health over centuries? Could the labor of ordinary caregivers have saved far more lives than the theories and surgeries recorded in history books? By the end of the Middle Ages, medicine had evolved into a patchwork of theory, observation, and practical care. In sections 1 and 2, we examined the dangers of treatments based on humoral theory, the hazards of surgery, and the slow development of hospitals and community care. Now, we consider the broader consequences of these practices, the human resilience they required, and the lessons they offer for understanding health and survival across history. The first important point is that medieval medicine was as much about care as cure. Most treatments were limited in their effectiveness. Bloodletting could weaken a patient, toxic compounds could harm, and surgery carried a high risk of infection. Yet survival often depended on the repetitive, mundane labor of daily care. Nursing, feeding, washing, changing bedding, and applying simple herbal remedies made the difference between life and death. In hospitals, monasteries, or homes, caregivers created routines that, although unglamorous, stabilized patients long enough for the body to recover. Human persistence, repetition, and observation were the foundations of survival. This labor-intensive approach highlights the role of ordinary people in medical history. Physicians were scarce, expensive, and their treatments could be dangerous. Midwives, herbalists, and family members provided the bulk of care, performing repetitive tasks that were often invisible in historical records. Communities learned to adapt, developing practical routines, isolating the sick during epidemics, managing waste to reduce contamination, and organizing local remedies. These systems created resilience, even in the absence of advanced knowledge about microbes or sterilization. The quiet labor of survival, often overlooked, was a cornerstone of medieval healthcare. Medieval medicine also demonstrates the limitations of human understanding and the consequences of misplaced authority. Reliance on ancient texts, astrology, and humoral theory meant that treatments were guided by tradition rather than empirical efficacy. While some herbal remedies were beneficial, others were harmful, and the success of treatment was unpredictable. Yet, even with these limitations, incremental improvements occurred over centuries. Observation, experience, and shared knowledge slowly refined practices, laying the groundwork for later medical advances. In this sense, the danger inherent in medieval medicine also fueled the slow evolution of healthcare. The story of medieval medicine is also a story of adaptation under constraint. Disease, injury, and limited resources demanded creative solutions. Communities improvised with what they had: herbs from gardens, simple sanitation measures, dietary guidance, and careful attention to daily routines. In many cases, these pragmatic responses were more effective than high-status interventions, underscoring the importance of practical knowledge in historical survival. One particularly illustrative example comes from epidemic response. During outbreaks of plague or dysentery, urban hospitals filled beyond capacity. Physicians could offer little more than observation and supportive care, while attendants and families worked tirelessly to provide water, clean bedding, and food. Isolation and rudimentary quarantine were applied when possible. Though primitive, these strategies reduced transmission and mortality, relying on discipline, repetition, and human diligence rather than sophisticated theory. The mundane, slow work of caregiving became the most effective form of medicine in times of crisis. From a modern perspective, medieval medicine may appear dangerous, primitive, or even cruel. Yet it also reveals the resilience of human communities. Survival depended not on a single heroic intervention, but on the coordinated effort of many individuals performing repetitive, careful, and often invisible tasks. Hospitals, monasteries, families, and local healers collectively shaped outcomes, showing that ordinary labor, when applied consistently, could stabilize populations even under conditions of profound risk. The legacy of medieval medicine extends beyond the Middle Ages. It laid the foundations for modern healthcare by establishing routines, observational practices, and organized care systems. The importance of hygiene, diet, and preventive measures, though not fully understood in microbial terms, emerged through centuries of empirical experience. Community-based caregiving, structured hospital routines, and incremental experimentation all contributed to the slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually inform more systematic and safer medical practices. Finally, as we reflect on this history, an unresolved question emerges. If the visible, dramatic treatments of physicians were often less effective than the repetitive, mundane care of ordinary caregivers, how might our understanding of medical progress be skewed? Are there countless acts of quiet diligence in human history, like feeding, washing, or monitoring patients, that shape survival more than celebrated breakthroughs? Medieval medicine, in all its danger and tedium, teaches that the seemingly boring details of care, attention, repetition, and perseverance can be more consequential than brilliance or innovation. It reminds us that survival often depends on human consistency, adaptability, and resilience, qualities that quietly underpin history itself. When you imagine medieval life, you may picture castles, knights, and bustling towns, but beneath the surface, everyday living was often unsanitary, uncomfortable, and hazardous. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was a constant struggle against environmental conditions, limited technology, and cultural practices that shaped how people bathed, disposed of waste, and maintained their homes. The story of medieval hygiene is not dramatic in the sense of battles or political intrigue, yet it profoundly influenced survival, health, and the rhythm of daily life. Let's start with bathing and personal cleanliness. Contrary to popular belief, people did bathe in the Middle Ages, but the frequency and methods varied widely depending on region, class, and cultural norms. Public bathhouses existed in towns such as Paris, London, and Cologne, offering communal bathing facilities with heated water. However, these bathhouses were often crowded, poorly maintained, and associated with social gatherings that mixed hygiene with recreation, and sometimes vice. For the rural poor, bathing might be limited to rivers, ponds, or seasonal cold water washes. The elite, by contrast, could afford private tubs or heated rooms, though even their facilities had limitations in terms of sanitation and odor control. Bathing was also influenced by medical and religious beliefs. Some physicians argued that frequent immersion in water could weaken the humors, disrupt health, or make the body more vulnerable to disease. Meanwhile, certain religious traditions alternately encouraged ritual cleansing or regarded excessive washing as vanity. The result was a tension between necessity and belief. People knew hygiene was important, but sometimes avoided bathing due to fear of health consequences, social norms, or lack of resources. Closely tied to bathing was the challenge of waste disposal. Medieval towns lacked modern sewage systems. Most urban residents relied on chamber pots emptied into the streets, gutters, or nearby rivers. Waste accumulation attracted flies and rodents, creating an environment where disease could thrive. Privies existed in castles and monasteries, often as wooden structures over pits, but maintenance was irregular, and odors were pervasive. In towns, open gutters served as drainage, carrying not only water, but also human and animal waste, contaminating the very streets where people walked, traded, and socialized. Laundry and clothing hygiene presented another set of challenges. Washing textiles was labor-intensive, requiring boiling water, lye, and manual scrubbing. For the average household, clothes were infrequently cleaned, resulting in long-term accumulation of dirt, sweat, and lice. Bedding, too, was rarely washed, with straw mattresses and woolen blankets providing ideal habitats for fleas and mites. Regular laundering was reserved for wealthier households, while the poor relied on infrequent washing or airing of fabrics in the sun. The labor required to maintain cleanliness was repetitive, exhausting, and time-consuming, yet it was crucial for preventing skin diseases and infestations. Food hygiene was no less precarious. Kitchens were often located near waste areas or animal pens, and food could spoil rapidly due to limited preservation methods. Salt, as explored in Story 3, was essential for preserving meat and fish, but fresh produce and dairy posed constant risks of contamination. Cooking was laborious and required careful attention to fire management, utensils, and storage. The failure to maintain even modest standards of cleanliness could lead to widespread illness in a household or village. Water supply was another constant concern. Wells, rivers, and springs provided drinking water, but contamination was common. In urban areas, runoff from streets or cesspits often entered water sources, spreading pathogens. People sometimes boiled water or used rudimentary filtration methods, but knowledge was inconsistent, and access to safe water varied by social status and geography. Survival often depended on careful observation, routine cleaning, and practical improvisation, rather than theoretical understanding of disease transmission. Occupational hygiene also shaped daily life. Blacksmiths, butchers, and tanners worked with animal byproducts and chemicals that created foul smells and unsanitary conditions. The labor-intensive, repetitive work of cleaning tools, washing hands, and managing waste was essential to prevent infection, yet often performed without protective measures. These practices were monotonous and largely invisible to outsiders, yet they directly influenced health outcomes. Disease prevention was closely tied to hygiene, but complicated by contemporary medical theory. Physicians often prescribe dietary regulation, herbs, or bloodletting as means of maintaining humoral balance, rather than emphasizing cleanliness. At the same time, empirical observations led to practices like separating waste from living areas, airing out rooms, and boiling water, which had practical benefits even if their rationale was misunderstood. Daily routines, washing hands, cleaning floors, handling waste, and preparing food carefully were the most effective defenses against disease, illustrating how survival often depended on repetition and diligence rather than medical theory. Even within elite households and castles, hygiene was laborious, bathing was occasional, and water had to be heated over fires. Latrines required maintenance, and straw bedding had to be replaced regularly. Servants performed endless repetitive tasks, fetching water, cleaning chambers, washing clothes, and preparing food, all of which directly impacted the health of residents. The contrast between perceived luxury and practical hygiene underscores that survival depended on sustained, often invisible labor, regardless of social status. By the end of this section, it becomes clear that medieval hygiene was a constant struggle against environmental hazards, material limitations, and social norms. It was neither glamorous nor easy, but it was central to survival. Life in towns, villages, and castles depended on repetitive, invisible routines: washing, scrubbing, boiling, airing, and cleaning. Disease, infestation, and infection were persistent threats, mitigated only by human diligence, and one unresolved thought remains. Given the labor, observation, and improvisation required for even basic hygiene, how much of medieval survival depended on these repetitive, mundane acts? Were ordinary people, through their daily routines, the true defenders of health, quietly protecting communities long before modern sanitation and medicine existed? In Section 1, we examined the everyday realities of bathing, waste disposal, water management, and household cleaning in medieval Europe. Now we step back to consider the broader implications. How hygiene, or the lack of it, shaped social structures, urban development, public health, and the ways communities adapted to survive under unsanitary conditions. Medieval towns were hubs of both commerce and contamination. Streets were narrow, often unpaved, and served simultaneously as thoroughfares for people, animals, and waste. Livestock wandered freely, leaving dung in the same areas where merchants set up stalls, while chamber pots emptied into gutters or directly onto the street. The result was an environment rich in nutrients for rats, flies, and other pests, and a prime breeding ground for disease. Urban authorities faced the constant challenge of regulating cleanliness, a task that required laws, inspections, and the repetitive labor of street cleaning. The mundane work of removing refuse, sweeping streets, and repairing drainage was essential to maintaining health. Yet it was rarely recognized as heroic or noteworthy. Epidemics were both the consequence and driver of hygiene practices. Plagues, typhoid, dysentery, and other infectious diseases spread quickly in unsanitary conditions. Mortality rates could soar during outbreaks, overwhelming hospitals and communities alike. Authorities responded in ways that mixed observation, superstition, and practicality. Quarantine measures, for example, were implemented in port cities like Venice in the 14th century, requiring ships to remain isolated for 40 days, hence the term quarantine. Streets were cleaned, markets temporarily closed, and infected households isolated. These measures were repetitive, exhausting, and often unpopular. Yet they mitigated the worst effects of disease, illustrating the critical importance of everyday routines in public health. The social dimensions of hygiene were profound. Wealthy households had access to private wells, baths, and latrines, while poorer communities relied on shared or contaminated water sources. Public bathhouses served as sites of both hygiene and social interaction. Yet they were sometimes viewed with suspicion due to moral or religious concerns. People of lower status had to improvise, washing in rivers, boiling water when possible, and taking measures to protect themselves from pests, and contamination. In this sense, daily routines of hygiene were not merely practical, they were a reflection of social hierarchy, resource access, and labor organization. Sanitation infrastructure, or the lack thereof, shaped urban planning. Some medieval towns attempted to organize waste removal using open drains, cesspits, or covered gutters. Rivers were used to carry away human and industrial waste, though this often contaminated drinking water downstream. Castles and monasteries developed latrines over moats or pits, relying on repeated maintenance to prevent overflow or stench. These systems required constant, monotonous labor, emptying pits, cleaning gutters, and monitoring water flow. Survival in densely populated areas depended on these repetitive tasks as much as on diet, medicine, or shelter. Hygiene also influenced labor and gender roles. Women, servants, and lower status workers were responsible for much of the daily cleaning, water fetching, laundering, and preparation of food. This invisible labor formed the backbone of household health and community resilience. Men engaged in outdoor labor, but they too had to contend with sanitation issues, particularly in trades involving animals, food, or waste. The repetitive, physically demanding nature of these tasks meant that hygiene was both an individual responsibility and a collective endeavor, sustained by observation, routine, and coordination. The impact of poor hygiene on childhood survival cannot be overstated. Infants and young children were particularly vulnerable to disease, and parents relied on basic routines: boiling water, washing hands, cleaning bedding, and carefully preparing food. These practices, repeated daily, were far more effective at preventing mortality than many medical interventions of the time. The survival of a household often depended on the quiet, consistent work of maintaining cleanliness and managing exposure to contaminants. Dietary hygiene also played a role. Food was prepared over open fires, often near sources of contamination. Salt, as discussed in Story 3, was essential for preservation. Yet meat, fish, and dairy still posed risks of spoilage. Bread, a staple, could harbor mold if not properly baked or stored. Households developed routines to mitigate these risks. Careful storage, observation of spoilage, and communal knowledge about preparation and timing. The repetition of these seemingly mundane tasks, washing pots, cleaning utensils, drying grains, formed the practical foundation of food safety. Even religious institutions grappled with hygiene. Monasteries and convents sought to maintain cleanliness in living quarters, kitchens, and infirmaries. Washing, laundering, and maintaining latrines were part of the daily rhythm, integrated into prayer schedules and communal labor. By combining spiritual practice with practical routines, these institutions inadvertently contributed to disease prevention and survival, demonstrating how repetition and discipline reinforced health outcomes. By the end of this section, it becomes clear that hygiene shapes survival on multiple levels: individual, household, community, and urban. Daily routines, repeated tirelessly, determined whether people contracted disease, survived epidemics, or avoided infestations. Human ingenuity through cleaning, water management, waste disposal, and dietary preparation provided resilience against an otherwise hostile environment. Even though medieval hygiene was rudimentary by modern standards, these repetitive, mundane practices were vital to life. And one unresolved question lingers. If survival depended so heavily on repetitive, invisible labor, how much of history's outcomes, epidemic control, urban growth, childhood survival hinged on these quiet acts, rather than on dramatic events or heroic figures? Could it be that ordinary routines of hygiene, largely forgotten, shaped medieval society more than we ever realize? By the end of the Middle Ages, the struggle for hygiene remained a constant and often unseen battle. In sections 1 and 2, we explored the daily realities of bathing, waste disposal, water management, and household cleaning, as well as the broader social, urban, and public health implications. Now, we reflect on the ultimate consequences of these practices, the lessons learned from human labor and adaptation, and the ways medieval hygiene shaped society. The first key consequence is that hygiene directly influenced survival. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and inadequate cleaning contributed to widespread illness, epidemics, and high childhood mortality. Conversely, communities that developed disciplined routines, regular cleaning of latrines and streets, boiling water, washing bedding, and preserving food, mitigated the worst effects of disease. Survival was rarely the result of heroic intervention. Instead, it depended on repeated, mundane labor carried out consistently over time. Human diligence, more than medical knowledge or advanced infrastructure, underpinned life itself. Urban development was also profoundly shaped by hygiene, or the attempts to manage its absence. Streets, drainage systems, and waste disposal practices were planned not only for commerce and transport, but also to reduce contamination. Towns that invested in maintaining basic sanitation fared better during epidemics, while cities that neglected these systems suffered devastating mortality. Hygiene, therefore, was a silent driver of urban prosperity, influencing trade, population density, and social stability. The repetitive labor of cleaning, repairing, and monitoring infrastructure formed the invisible backbone of medieval civic life. Hygiene further reinforced social hierarchies and labor structures. Wealthier households and institutions could afford private wells, latrines, and regular laundering, while poorer communities relied on shared water sources, public bathhouses, and improvised cleaning practices. Servants, women, and low-status workers bore the brunt of hygiene labor, from washing clothes and preparing food to tending to the sick and maintaining living spaces. These repetitive tasks, though invisible in historical accounts, were essential for the survival of entire households and communities. In essence, daily hygiene routines were a quiet form of labor that supported society from the ground up. Epidemics exposed both the fragility and the resilience of medieval populations. Disease spread rapidly in unsanitary environments, yet communities adapted through practical routines and improvisation. Quarantines, cleaning streets, isolating the sick, and attending to food and water hygiene were all forms of repetitive intervention that saved countless lives. These efforts, repeated day after day, illustrate a crucial point. The mundane work of survival often mattered more than dramatic medical or military responses to crises. Ordinary human diligence became the most effective defense against catastrophe. Hygiene also shaped cultural and institutional practices. Monasteries, convents, and hospitals institutionalized daily routines of cleaning, laundering, and food preparation. Religious rituals, bathing customs, and dietary practices all intersected with health and survival. The integration of spiritual discipline with practical hygiene reinforced regular, repetitive behaviors that reduced disease risk. Over time, these practices contributed to incremental improvements in public health and laid the foundation for more systematic sanitation measures in the modern era. From a broader perspective, medieval hygiene highlights a profound historical lesson: the importance of repetitive, invisible labor in shaping human outcomes. While wars, politics, and technology often dominate historical narratives, survival depended equally on daily routines that few chroniclers noted. Fetching water, washing clothes, maintaining floors, and carefully storing food were all acts that quietly determined the health of families, communities, and cities. These boring practices were not glamorous, but they were essential, and they shaped the course of history in ways that remain underappreciated. Finally, an unresolved reflection emerges. If medieval survival relied so heavily on repetitive, mundane hygiene practices, how many other critical aspects of human history, childcare, food preparation, labor routines have been overlooked because they were considered ordinary? Could the quiet, consistent work of ordinary people have determined societal resilience more than the dramatic events we typically remember?